The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello and welcome back to The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, in our first episode of this new series, we look at so-called cancel culture. At what point should an artist's actions make us question the validity of their work? I talked to Erich Hatala Matthes of Wellesley College, who's writing a book on immoral artists about how useful the notion of cancelling may be. And with the art newspaper's correspondent Tom Seymour and the photographer and lecturer Lewis Bush, we explore the cases of Martin Parr and David Allen Harvey, two photographers whose activities have recently come under scrutiny. And we're continuing our series Work of the Week. This time, the artist Tavares Strachan talks about Robert Smithson's earthwork from 1970, the Spiral Jetty. Before all that, a reminder that you can catch up with the art newspaper's other podcast, A Brush With, 4 in-depth conversations that I had with artists about the art, books, music and more that have defined their life and work. The artists in Series 1 are Michael Armitage, Jenny Saville, Chantal Joffe and Rashid Johnson. You can subscribe to A Brush With on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you're listening now. And we've also launched a book club at the art newspaper with news, excerpts, interviews, live events and more. You can sign up to the monthly book club newsletter and indeed all of our newsletters at theartnewspaper.com. Click on the newsletter link at the top right of the page. Now, cancel culture is a term that's been bandied about loosely over recent years, but what does it mean and what are its implications? Well, to try to unpack it, I spoke to Erich Hatala Matthes, an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, who's writing a book on immoral artists. Erich, I wanted to begin by asking a general question. Is cancel culture even a useful term?
That's a great question to start with. I think that cancel culture is an idea that we need to grapple with because of how ubiquitous it's become. If you read almost any publication, you're going to hear so much about cancel culture these days. But I think ultimately, when we try to sort of get under the surface and figure out exactly what cancel culture is, it becomes a pretty unuseful term because so many different ways of approaching the immorality of artists get lumped in with cancel culture. So, for instance, there was a lot of discussion in the past year about canceling the artist Gauguin, and the New York Times ran a big story. Is it time to cancel Gauguin? And there was a lot of discussion about it. But then when you actually read the article, right, there wasn't anybody in the article who was critical of Gauguin who really wanted us to rip Gauguin off the walls or to stop looking at Gauguin or thinking about Gauguin. What they really wanted was just for everyone to take seriously, right, the morally bad things that Gauguin did, right? Abandoning his family, sexually exploiting Tahitian girls, and the way in which some of his bad features sort of show up in his work. So there's a danger, I think, in talking about cancel culture or just using this sort of general umbrella term cancel culture if it's going to obscure the more nuanced ways in which people are asking us to reckon with artistic immorality, not just saying, okay, you're done, erased, gone forever, right? But oftentimes just sort of taking seriously the fact that sometimes artists do terrible things, and that's something that we need to think about in relation to their work itself.
And I think that's really something that's writ large in Gauguin's work, isn't it? It's not like he's creating abstract paintings when he's in Tahiti. He's depicting his life there very graphically, and it's writ large on the works that, we can see the kind of life he is living. So it is in no way an obfuscation of the content of the work to talk about what he's up to, right?
Exactly. I mean, it almost seems bizarre to display these works without explicitly discussing, right, that context and how he's there and what he's doing and what's going on in the work, right? As if there was something, dangerous about talking frankly and seriously about aspects of his work that have an objectionable or immoral character to them. That it's right there, like you say. So I think that's a case that makes it particularly strange to act as if there's something that's going to be wrong or harmful about thinking about these features. I mean, I think that the way in which it gets framed by some curators or museum folks is that they worry about the work then being boycotted, right? And it's not as if that never happens or nobody calls for that kind of a response, but I certainly wouldn't say that it's the norm. And I think that if museums and galleries were more proactive about taking seriously these aspects of artists' lives that people want to be reckoned with transparently, there would be less motivation for the occasional call to boycott in the first place.
You draw out a really interesting comparison, I think, between Gauguin and Caravaggio, who is an artist who also engaged in a very extreme form of morally dubious activity in the sense that he killed someone. Can you expand on that? Because I think that there's a very interesting distinction that you make between those two artists.
Right. So Caravaggio murdered somebody purportedly in the course of trying to castrate him. That's pretty bad. That's immoral behavior, right? And it's of a form that's different in a number of ways from Gauguin's. Most markedly, I think, in that although we would have a negative moral reaction to what Caravaggio has done, Caravaggio's act of murder doesn't really show up in his work as a lens through which we interpret the work. So while there's no reason to ignore it or sweep it under the rug, it has less obvious aesthetic significance to our interpretation of Caravaggio. Whereas, as we discussed earlier, right, Gauguin's work is emblematic of this certain, Western white male gaze that involves the eroticization and exploitation of women of color. And so the things that are, the things that Gauguin did in his life that we judge from a moral perspective are really integral to his work, right? And you see other artists then picking up aspects of that, of his work in that way and responding to them in their own art. So, for instance, in Kehinde Wiley's series that is sort of grappling with Gauguin's legacy. And so, one thing that's really important to see, I think, is that the immorality of an artist or some of a bad thing that they've done can show up in their work in different ways and have different aesthetic significance to how we interpret that work. And I think, a further thing worth mentioning is that it's important that we still engage with and view the work of morally questionable artists like Gauguin, because without the ability to sort of have that direct confrontation with the work, right, and acknowledging the sins of the artist, it makes it difficult to understand and appreciate the later work that is responding to and grappling with that legacy, right? How would you understand and appreciate Kehinde Wiley's work if you hadn't seen Gauguin, right? So I think that there's an important way in which we need to think, on the one hand, transparently about the immoral actions of artists when confronting their work, but in a way that doesn't involve getting rid of that work, right, or censoring that work, because there's an important aspect of our aesthetic engagement with it that is colored by its immorality and that is important for moral progress even.
You also cite an example of a living artist who has literally had a form of cancellation in the form of Chuck Close, who was due to have this exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, but because of accusations of sexual harassment, which he denies, that show was indefinitely postponed. It certainly hasn't happened, and it was said to be postponed at the time. That is an example of a tangible cancellation. What do you make of that?
So I think that actions like that can be really useful ways of responding to legitimate, credible charges against artists. And I think that one way that it's productive to think about cases like that is this. I think we can distinguish between engaging with an artist's work and honoring the artist, right? So honoring the artist putting them forward on a pedestal as somebody to be admired, right, is something that we often do in the arts. And in the face of serious accusations like those faced by Close, I think it's reasonable for galleries and museums to say, you know what, we don't want to honor this artist right now, right? We have serious concerns about this artist's behavior. And I think, refraining from honoring them in those ways is a good way of listening to their alleged victims and taking their charges seriously and communicating to the general public that we're not going to sweep allegations against artists under the rug just because they're famous or influential, that we are going to take them seriously. Now, I think that we can do that and sort of take those actions without simultaneously thinking that we then also need to call for the systematic removal of any work of Chuck Close by any museum or gallery, right? Because there are ways, as we've discussed, of engaging with a work, right, that don't necessarily need to involve the kind of honoring of the artist, acting as if allegations of immorality against them don't matter, right, ignoring their victims. I think there are ways in which we can render these two things consistent, right? Now, I do think that that's hardest to do when it comes to the visual arts, because the way in which we engage with the visual arts, showing works in museums and galleries, feels like it's inherently honoring them. It's much more difficult, I think, than in literature, for instance, or film, where we can say, you know what, we're not going to give any awards or prizes to this particular artist anymore, but if you've got a copy of their work, you can read it. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a much harder distinction to draw in the visual arts, but I do think that it's one that's worth pursuing.
One thing I'm really intrigued about the whole cancel culture thing is that in some ways, by targeting individuals, it allows institutions to not address the situation, and we keep seeing this. The blame falls on the individuals, and it in some ways allows institutions to escape addressing their systemic issues. Is that your perception, or do you think it ultimately, by focusing on individuals, it leads to systemic analysis?
I am inclined to think that there's too much focus often on individuals rather than on institutions. I think institutional change is really essential to addressing some of these issues that with artistic morality that we keep confronting. I do think that the focus on individuals as an aspect of cancel culture is understandable, though, because it feels like a response to institutional failure, right? So when institutions don't hold artists accountable, right, when they sweep their behavior under the rug or don't take it seriously or ignore it, right, when there are consistent accusations against artists about their behavior, for instance, right, it's understandable that the public would say, we're going to hold this artist accountable in the way that the institution won't. I do think there are risks there. The philosopher Olufemi Taiwo has written recently in the Boston Review about the problem of elite capture in various contexts, including identity politics, where people in positions of power can sort of capitalize on the veneer of progressivism in order to market themselves in an admirable light without really changing much. And I think that this does happen in the context of the arts, right? After there's enough momentum surrounding a particular artist, an institution, whether it's a television network or a gallery, can say, like, oh yeah, we're not gonna forget that guy. We're not gonna show that person's work anymore. We're gonna completely cancel them. But then they don't actually change anything at the institution, right? So they're not making changes to make sure that their staff are more diverse. They're not making changes to ensure that when they work with artists, they're not going to continue to work with people who are credibly accused of predatory behavior, right? They don't make any changes at the level that would prevent these things from happening in the future. Instead, they offer these particular individual sacrifices. So I do think that more emphasis on institutional change is really crucial to thinking about how to make changes to the art world that will provide a better mechanism for confronting instances of immorality, whether it's in terms of predatory behavior or racism, misogyny, or other moral issues that arise.
You draw a distinction between bigots and predators. And it seems to me from this discussion that in a way, predators are an easier form of moral problem to deal with than bigotry, because as you say, the bigotry is much more about a systemic problem than an individual predator. Is that your argument?
I think that's fair to say. I think that, with predators, it is often easier to identify a particular victim of a particular, predatory individual. And so we're in a better position to say, hey, if we can do something to prevent this individual from exercising the power that they have to prey on others, right, which is often in the arts a kind of social power or celebrity, right, then we can really make a difference in preventing this individual from preying on people in the way that they have. It's much harder to say that in the case of general bigotry, right? Obviously, all kinds of forms of bigotry, racism, homophobia, sexism, etc., have all kinds of victims, right? That's for sure. But it's harder to say, well, this particular artist is responsible for the victimization of this particular individual, right? So I think there's less that we can obviously do to prevent particular harm to particular individuals when it comes to grappling with bigotry, as opposed to instances of predatory behavior. But that's just to say that it makes it all the more important that the response that we take to bigotry is of this institutional form, that we pursue these broader kinds of systemic improvement and reorganization in order to provide ways to address the more diffuse way in which instances of bigotry create victims, right, in contrast with the more sort of one-on-one or individualized nature of predatory harm.
Okay, well, Erich, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Erich Hatala Matthes' book on immoral artists is published next year by Oxford University Press, and you can read some of Erich's writings at Apollo Magazine's website. In a moment, we'll discuss recent cancel culture debates around two photographers, but first, here are a few of the top stories on the Art Newspaper's website this week. The organisers of Art Basel have cancelled the fair's Miami Beach edition, scheduled to run from the 3rd to the 6th of December, amid ongoing concerns over the global coronavirus crisis. The fair's global director, Mark Spiegler, director in the Americas, Noah Horowitz, and director in Asia, Adeline Uy, wrote in a joint letter sent to exhibitors that the impact of coronavirus, limitations and uncertainty about the staging of large-scale events, international travel restrictions and bans, as well as quarantine regulations within the United States and internationally, gave Art Basel no other option but to cancel the 2020 edition. The Tate, the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Centre Pompidou have defended their partnerships with state-owned companies in China in the face of mounting criticism of the country's extensive human rights abuses. Christina Ruiz's detailed report explores the museum's lucrative deals in the context of growing evidence of the detention of Muslim Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region, the crackdown on protesters in Hong Kong, and pervasive state censorship. In an interview with the Art Newspaper, the artist Ai Weiwei says that if organisations do not question Chinese state power, they become complicit in it. And finally, Nancy Kenny reports that staff from the Louvre Museum and the Directorate General of Antiquities of Lebanon have begun overseeing work on a joint rehabilitation project at the National Museum of Beirut, which was heavily damaged in last month's explosion in the city's port area. The blast destroyed the museum's windows and doors and caused serious damage to the security system. Teams from the Louvre's Departments of Near Eastern Antiquities and Architectural Heritage and Gardens have been assisting the Directorate General in mapping out a recovery plan. You can read these stories and much more at theartnewspaper.com or on our app for iOS, which you can get from the App Store. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Launching the autumn season with upcoming sales in New York, Paris and London, Christie's 20th century sales celebrate the emergence of the defining modern art era to the cutting-edge contemporary art of today. Highlights across sale rooms include masterworks by Pollock and Noland, in addition to a superlative watercolour example by Cézanne leading the sales in New York. Discover the season's top works and collections and explore related features in advance of the highly anticipated sales beginning in October. The refreshed schedule complements Christie's online only and private sales offerings. Bid and buy art at any time and from anywhere. Find out more on christies.com. Now, the world of photography has been shaken by two recent stories that have brought the culture around the discipline under scrutiny. Pressure built on the photographic agency Magnum after the photographer and writer Andy Day wrote that an image taken by the American photographer David Allen Harvey, part of a series titled Bangkok, Thailand Prostitutes, featured an almost naked, fully identifiable and allegedly pubescent woman in what appears to be a Bangkok brothel, apparently taken from the perspective of a client seated on a bed which the girl is approaching. Magnum used the keywords prostitute and girl 13 to 18 years in their description of the image. Magnum has pledged to immediately launch an in-depth internal review into their archive of more than 1 million images. Meanwhile, a cancel culture debate raged about another of Magnum's members, Martin Parr. He quit as the artistic director of the first Bristol Photo Festival after it emerged that he had promoted and edited a book which featured a racist spread of images. Mercedes Baptiste Halliday, a student at University College London, drove an 18-month protest against the book and Parr's involvement. I spoke about these stories to Tom Seymour, a correspondent at the art newspaper who specialises in photography, and Lewis Bush, a photographer who leads the MA Photojournalism and Documentary Photography course at the London College of Communication. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
And Lewis, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Lewis, in a piece on your website, you've questioned whether Magnum is really doing all it can in relation to the David Allen Harvey case, because there's a sort of partial erasure in the sense that the images have been taken down. But could Magnum have been doing more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in the case of David Allen Harvey, you have a photographer who basically more and more questions have been raised about the nature of the images he produces and the kind of the situations in which he's been as a photographer. And one image in particular was flagged up by quite a lot of people as very problematic because it basically appeared, based on the content of the image and the way it was captioned and tagged on the Magnum site, it appeared to show a victim of child sexual abuse, which in a lot of countries, including the UK, is illegal. So, if it proved to be the case, then essentially Magnum and David Allen Harvey would have been involved in, a crime. It's still, again, an open question because they claim that it was a mistake and so on and so forth. Magnum's response so far has been an investigation and Harvey's been suspended, but actually not over that image, over something separate from that, which has been an accusation made against him by someone. The issue with these people like Harvey is often actually that they're at the tip of the iceberg, and actually what they represent, the reason they're interesting and worth talking about is because they often represent much deeper kind of structural problems in both the organisations they belong to or the fields that they belong to. And I think certainly in terms of Magnum, you can definitely make a criticism that what Harvey is alleged to have done is a kind of extreme version of stuff that actually a lot of Magnum photographers have done over the years, which is basically to take advantage of people in very vulnerable positions. The distinction with Harvey's work is he's done it in a way which is potentially criminal. And that's why it's obviously generated a lot of debate. So, yeah, absolutely. The concern often for me is that actually organisations, especially ones that are very focused on their self-image, as I would say Magnum is, they move very quickly to distance themselves from these people or to kind of hide them. And I think, the way Harvey has disappeared to a large extent from the Magnum website is an example of that, in order to protect their brand and their self-image, but not in a way that actually learns any kind of longer-term lessons about, how these things have happened and what can be done to kind of prevent them in the future.
In your piece about Magnum, you wrote very interestingly about this culture of the prestige of Magnum and how this self-image is problematic about, in terms of a critical overview of how it behaves. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think it's a twofold problem. One of the parts of the problem kind of really goes back to Magnum's formation and I mean, it was created by a group of incredible photographers, but at least one of whom certainly had a very strong reputation for kind of self-promotion and a very strong sense of his own brand. And I think that if you look at Magnum's history over the subsequent decades, you can see that traces of that creation remain. So the Magnum brand has always been quite an important aspect of it. And I mean, certainly as a young photographer, I can only speak for myself, although I often hear this from students of mine and other people. As a young photographer, Magnum was this kind of ideal to aspire to. And I think it, very much it creates that intentionally, that position of itself as the kind of the apex of the industry. Whether that's true or not is another question. But I mean, that's already a problem. But then I think what's interesting is in the last few years, Magnum is obviously, like a lot of photojournalism agencies and organisations, has been hit by the challenges that there's less and less money available for commissioning, for example, original photojournalism. And so they've increasingly kind of diversified, I suppose you could say. They basically created this kind of Magnum commercial branch, and they've been very proactive about, in a way, monetizing the brand in other ways. So things like print sales, education. They've got some very kind of, from the sound of things, at least judging by the fees, lucrative educational partnerships, including, I should say, with the institution I teach for. And I actually used to teach on one of those courses. In the interests of transparency, I should say, I basically stopped because I was paid very little for it compared to the Magnum photographers. So I should just get that out there. But I think this kind of monetization has added to the importance of kind of protecting the brand, that now it's not just about the reputation of the photographers, and their association with Magnum, but it's also actually about their financial kind of the brand's financial security that needs to be protected from these kinds of accusations. And that's one of the reasons, at least that I think, we see these kinds of accusations being dealt with in the way they have been.
I mean, does Magnum have any responsibility to anyone other than themselves? I mean, it's a photographer-run organisation. Do they have to publish anything of this investigation that they're doing? As they're not the Tate or the Photographers Gallery or another public institution. So why should they publish a report in which may well find out some very troubling things?
I mean, it's interesting that I think there've been quite a few attempts by people to get access even to their code of conduct. So basically, after they kind of started this diversification campaign, I mean that financially, not in terms of membership, although they have also done that a bit. They introduced a code of conduct for Magnum photographers, and apparently that's what Harvey has been suspended over, as his actions or his alleged actions are considered a breach of that code of conduct. But incredibly, Magnum, from everything I've read, refused to release the code of conduct even, which seems kind of incredible, because you'd think the point of having a document like that is that it's public and transparent. So yeah, I mean, I think whether they'll release the results of these findings are an interesting question. I mean, as you say, I think there's not very much anyone can do to force them, apart from in terms of this kind of public pressure for greater transparency from them.
Right. So let's move on to talking about a member of the Magnum family, as it were. Martin Parr. And Tom, you've done a lot of reporting around a very particular incident relating to him, which relates to a book. So give us the context of that.
So I think around 2017, a young black woman from London was bought a book published by and edited by Martin Parr called London by an Italian photographer called Gian Burattini. And in the middle of this book, there's a spread, so two images edited side by side, of a black woman working as a ticket inspector on the London Underground in the late 1960s. And she sat in a ticket booth on the London Underground stamping tickets. And edited next to that image, that portrait, is an image of a gorilla in a cage in London Zoo. Now, she, as a result of seeing this spread in this book, which is edited and has been, and was sort of heavily promoted by Martin Parr, including giving a sort of talk about it at Photo London.
I noticed in your piece he signed copies of this book.
Yeah. That I should mention that he is keen to sort of stress that the Italian publisher, they tried to over-egg how much he was involved in the actual publication of the book, and edited by Martin Parr was a sort of promotional marketing exercise of them, and he actually is keen to claim that he didn't actually have that much oversight over the book. But she launched a campaign against Martin Parr, which included her going to his exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery at the time and writing to his foundation in Bristol, and was essentially ignored and actually dismissed by his staff at one point in a pretty brutal way. And she carried on social media, mostly on Twitter, like trying to raise attention to this book, and increasingly more and more people who were interested in photo ethics started to retweet her and started to engage with the sentiment. And over the course of 2 or 3 years, this sort of snowballed to the point where the pressure on Martin Parr was so great that he decided of his own accord to resign as the artistic director of the inaugural Bristol Photography Festival. And he's also, I should add, he has requested that the publishers destroy the original book, which is a bit of a can of worms to open up. And there's actually been a lot of scrutiny about other books that he's lent his name to over the last few years. In particular, a book by a Spanish photographer called, and I may mispronounce his name, but Jacques Salvans, called The Waiting Game, which is essentially images taken with a long lens camera of sex workers working in various parts of Spain. And the photographer posed as a surveyor wearing a high-vis jacket and took images of the sex workers from a long distance, so obviously without their consent. And Parr wrote an introduction to the book, basically like celebrating how this photographer was able to take these images without the women's consent. And that has also caused a lot of controversy online, and has, I think it's fair to say, very much damaged the reputation of a photographer who, and I mean, not until recently, seemed very untouchable, pretty much.
Lewis, what's your take on all this? I mean, I find it very, very difficult to understand how Martin Parr could have written something, even if he is distancing himself, how he could have written something for that book without seeing that image in, the 21st century and not thinking it was problematic and not wanting to lend his name to it. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the image spread, I find it kind of incredible that anyone born or kind of alive in the last 60 years or more couldn't recognize that spread as problematic. I mean, there's a debate about the photographer's original intention with the spread, but even so, obviously one of the questions with these things comes down to the question of intent versus interpretation. I just think the inevitable interpretation of that spread is so problematic that whether the photographer actually intended it to be racist or not is almost besides the point. The idea that you'd represent it in a kind of facsimile edition without, at the very least, giving kind of context to it, just seems to me basically the two conclusions you can either draw from that is that Parr is kind of oblivious to race, or equally that he didn't really look at the book before he lent his name to it, or that he kind of doesn't see a problem. I mean, he picked up on it and doesn't see a problem with it. I'm not sure that you can really come out of it with any other kind of conclusions. And again, a bit like some of the other examples we've talked about, I think for me what it really reflects is that it's again a tip of an iceberg thing, in the sense that photography much more broadly is still very, and I'm totally acknowledge that I'm part of the problem here, is very kind of white, male, middle class, very undiverse. Magnum is very, for example, is very unrepresentative of the world at large, because it is largely white men, but actually you could say it's very representative of what photography is still like, which is white and male. So I mean, I think a lot of the responses from Parr, were fairly unconvincing. I don't think he really handled the whole thing well at all, including his response to the initial criticisms. Yeah.
Do you think it's acceptable that this work could be recontextualized? Could you represent this work and say there are deeply problematic images and spreads in this book? We need to talk about them. Is that an acceptable way to deal with it, or do you think Martin Parr's sort of belated call for it to be destroyed is a better response? What's the best way out of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I mean, it's in a way it's a question that people have been arguing over, probably for centuries, but certainly for at least since the early 20th century, about this question of how much you can take problematic work, contextualize it, and it can still play a role. It can still have a function. I mean, it also relates to this idea of the death of the author, and the question again of how important an author's intentions and also actually the author's personality and life is to the work that they've made. And I'm very hesitant to offer a definitive answer to that, because on the one hand, I totally feel that people people who produce kind of problematic or exploitative work, and again, the example of Salvin's project is a good one that Tom mentioned, shouldn't be promoted, essentially. But at the same time, often these works have things we can learn from them. I mean, I run a photography course. I teach the theory and ethics course unit within the course, amongst other things. And actually, I use a lot of problematic photography in that unit, with a lot of contextualization and warning and discussion with students about it, because actually often problematic photography is the most useful when you're trying to actually kind of teach students what not to do themselves. It's quite hard in a way to teach students only using positive examples. And equally, in terms of the field I teach, documentary photography, it has a very problematic history. So I mean, I'm resistant to the idea of this kind of idea of erasure of problematic work. There are plenty of examples in other fields of people who have problematic histories, problematic views, but actually still persist as kind of as figures, but with the context that we don't necessarily approve of this person or their opinions, but they produced work that has something potentially to offer with context.
It's important to say that when I broke the Parr story for the art newspaper, some of Buttarini's family who were still alive in Italy were obviously incredibly upset about the accusations of racism, and pointed out that Gian Buttarini himself was a lifelong anti-fascist campaigner alongside being a photographer, and he wrote in his original introduction to the book that he was interested in polemic combinations, and he would use photography to make points about how he saw the world, essentially. And when I was trying to get people to essentially engage in this subject, I found a lot of people, a lot of senior figures in photography actually thought Parr had been treated pretty badly, and actually thought that the book was open to interpretation, and there could be a debate about that, but they're actually fairly unwilling to stick their head above a parapet. One person that did speak out is a photographer called Damien Borgia, a Jewish photographer from London, and he said, everyone is just assuming that this is a racist book, whereas from my point of view, it is very possible that the photographer was trying to display that black people are treated like animals and are disproportionately incarcerated, which, from recent events, like that is a live question that can be represented through artwork. So I actually personally, and I'm willing to say, find it quite shocking that Parr was willing to destroy the book. And I think a lot of people find that statement to be problematic in itself.
But I suppose one of the interesting aspects about this is it possible to present that kind of imagery now without having that context explained, in the sense that, yes, if Gian Buttarini was a lifelong anti-fascist campaigner, to what extent does it need to be spelt out that this was an anti-racist combination? And how do you do that and still pay tribute to the work? I mean, I think it calls up all sorts of troubling aspects about not just the work, but also the interpretation of the work, right? So, but you can see completely why Mercedes Baptiste Halliday saw those images and found it immensely troubling that a major photographer was promoting this book, because the first thing you see when you see that, I've seen that spread, it looks like a terribly racist, offensive spread. So if to what extent do we always need a context, I suppose? Lewis, do you want to address this? Can you present that image again with a context and explain it? And can you ever leave a spread like that open to interpretation, given the history of race relations over the last many centuries?
I mean, one of the things about photography as a medium is, it's almost always open to interpretation. However much you contextualize it, there's always an element of people basically interpreting images to mean things that perhaps the author didn't intend. But I mean, I think here, that's just a caveat. I don't think that's the case here. I think, I mean, basically, to be completely blunt, this trope of comparing black people to gorillas has such a long history. I mean, it goes back to, eugenics, and it goes back to kind of social Darwinism. That, whether or not the photographer intended that, I think in a way he was remiss not to realize it would be read like that, either in the 1960s or in the future. And I think in the end, that's a big part of our responsibility as photographers, and it's a very difficult responsibility. And I know from my own experience, it's very hard to get right, and you don't always get it right, is to anticipate these different readings in advance. Failing that, where you have historic works that's problematic, I mean, it's very difficult to generalize about how much context different work needs. I mean, if you take maybe a very different example, like, say totalitarian art, say art from Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. I mean, I think that kind of artwork, to understand it properly, needs a lot of contextualization. When you see it presented seriously, it is given that, and when it doesn't have that, there's a very strong danger that it reverts back to its original purpose as kind of propaganda for an ideology that most people wouldn't agree with. So I mean, I think basically in this case, this image, its default kind of resting state is to reinforce a very well-worn racist trope, and unless it's very heavily contextualized, it will almost always default back to that meaning.
Tom, you write about photography very broadly, as Lewis does, and you are constantly, no doubt, writing about morally tricky situations.
Yeah, but I think that's a strength of the medium. That's part of the reason why I'm so fascinated by photography. It's a mobile medium which allows people to access corners of the world that otherwise they wouldn't be seen at all. We would never get any sort of insight into these communities and these places. I mean, Don McCullen's show at the Tate, I found that incredibly moving and powerful. But he's gone to war zones, all over the world and taking pictures of people, in the most tragic, horrendous, unimaginably awful moments of their lives. And they're being sold now for lots of money, and they're being celebrated in art galleries. You don't want to put an end to that. You don't want to limit someone who is willing to do that dangerous work. But there needs to be a conversation in photography which is reflective of the broader cultural conversations that we're having in the world, in politics. The fusing of those two things needs to happen in some way. I'm really unsure how it's going to turn out. I can't predict what's going to happen.
Okay, well, it's an enormous debate, and I'm sure we'll be returning to it. But for the moment, Tom and Lewis, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks very much.
You can read more of Tom's writings on this subject at theartnewspaper.com and Lewis's thoughts at dysphotic.com. That's disphotic.com. And finally, it's time for the work of the week. The artist Tavares Strachan has a show opening at Marion Goodman in London next week, and he's chosen a seminal work of land art, Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, the 1970 work in which Smithson used over 6,000 tonnes of basalt rocks and earth to form a spiral 1,500 feet long and 15 feet wide that winds from the northeastern shore of the Great Salt Lake in Utah in the US. You can see an image of the work at theartnewspaper.com, click on the podcast link and look for this episode. Tavares, tell me about why you've chosen Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson.
I think, for the most part, whenever you ask someone in the arts if they've seen Spiral Jetty, the answer generally is yes. And then you dig a little bit and then you realize that, in fact, when they say they've seen it, what they mean is they've seen a photo of it. And it raises all kinds of questions that are truly fundamental about the nature of the politics of seeing.
That's really interesting. So obviously that begs the inevitable question: have you made the pilgrimage to Utah to see it?
I would love to. The time, all of the times that I've wanted to see it, it's been underwater. So I haven't seen it. I've watched film, and I've, like most people, seen the photo documentation.
Yeah. And Smithson's film that you can see as well, which is so incredibly atmospheric in its own way.
Yeah, it's kind of a masterpiece in the sense that it is happening in 1970, 15 feet by 1,500 feet, the Great Salt Lake. There's a kind of there are these beautiful moments of entropy. There are these moments of visibility and invisibility that resonate deeply with me. And actually, there's a kind of really nice relationship to thinking about a site, the idea of a site and a non-site, a place and a non-place, in relation to all of the kind of political unrest that's happening right now in the world.
Can you explain a bit more about that? Because that's intriguing.
Well, if you think of the black body as a kind of non-site, then it has this really kind of fundamental and dramatic relationship between this object that comes in and out of visibility and in and out of focus. And I think Smithson's very much referencing and thinking about the fragility of life in and of itself. And I think if you think about the kind of diasporic body in the New World, it's a kind of potent parallel to think of these bodies that come in and out of focus and in and out of visibility, and are fundamentally difficult for the West to process and understand.
But it also had a fundamental connection to that landscape and the people who occupied that landscape before, in the sense that he was thinking about ancient forms, spiral forms that were found in the landscape by indigenous peoples, right, as well. So in a way, you know, he was reaching back to bodies across history to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that's why it's a kind of revolutionary work, and I think it also really was one of the early stages of getting contemporary artists to think about working outside of a kind of political or economic system, and developed and invented these kind of systems that have a new kind of currency, which becomes fundamental to the survival of the spirit of the artist.
Yeah, the whole idea of entropy, this idea that it existed to not exist as well, it seems to me was completely radical. And indeed, within 2 years it had disappeared and then stayed disappeared for 30 years. So it's sort of this very well documented but also invisible artwork. Is that something that also appeals, the way that time has its effect on it in that sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you imagine the kind of the brief history of what we would call contemporary art, maybe that timeline 40, 50 years ago, there was no such thing as a black artist, right? That just wasn't a thing. And so this shift from visibility to invisibility, I think is something that anyone who's an artist and is from any kind of diasporic region understands very deeply and very profoundly. So that the visibility, invisibility, coming in and out of focus is a kind of an ode to a kind of infinite game that I think Smithson's playing, right?
And also, I mean, Smithson was deeply, I mean, he shared so many of your concerns about those connections between science and art or broader culture, right? I mean, he was as much a scientific thinker as he was as a visual artist.
Yeah, and I also think if you think about this work in the context of 1970, and you think about what's going on in the world, and you think about what's going on in America, you'd believe that we're actually in 1970 right now.
You mean in terms of civil rights actions, the protests that were ongoing then and seem utterly resurrected right now?
Yeah, because I think that was a way of making space, right? Trying to create space where there wasn't any, and I think that's a lot of what the Earthwork project is about, right? It's about trying to find room when there is not much, creating a new kind of space, a new kind of place, and a new kind of location.
Talking about new kinds of location, I'm inevitably going to think about this work in which you moved this enormous ice block from the Arctic in reference to Matthew Henson, this polar explorer that has largely been forgotten, like so many of the people that you reference in your work. And inevitably, to me, that feels like a very Smithson kind of project. Was Smithson on your mind when you actually made that work?
I think Smithson's a deeply a kind of important artist for almost every artist I think alive today. Just because, like I said, so much about creative practice has to do with creating space. And, Smithson was thinking about this idea very early on. And I think what was potent about thinking about Smithson was this idea of being able to adapt and change the conversation. And when Smithson was doing it, maybe it wasn't the most important thing at the time, but it's over time evolving itself to become one of the more significant works of the 21st century. And I think that's really phenomenal, that he's taken nothing and made something out of it. Like literally.
Well, Tavares, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Tavares Strachan's exhibition In Plain Sight is at the Marion Goodman Gallery in London from the 8th of September until the 24th of October. And you can find out more about the Spiral Jetty at the Dia Foundation's website. That's diaart.org, diaart.org. And that's it for this week. Do subscribe to The Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. Click on the subscribe link at the top left of the page and you'll find a range of subscriptions. And please subscribe to this podcast and A Brush With if you haven't already, and give us a rating or review if you've enjoyed it. You can also find us on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The producers of The Week in Art are Julia Mahauska, Amy Dawson and David Clack, and David also does the editing and sound design. Thanks to Eric, Tom and Lewis and Tavares, and thank you for listening. See you next week. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.